Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this, a ThinkIn about the Maxwells. The ThinkIn was originally our idea. It taught us a way of bringing people together in an open news meeting, an open discussion, and there seems something peculiarly circular about a ThinkIn, an open editorial meeting on the life of Robert Maxwell, one of the last of a certain kind of press barons, newspaper barons. Um, but of course, it's a particularly curious story now because it's not just the story of Robert Maxwell, but the Maxwells, a story that stretches from my start as a newspaper journalist. One of the defining stories when I got into newspapering was the fall of Robert Maxwell, to a story that now that dominates the way in which we think about the news and politics and justice, the story of Ghislaine, Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And so in the course of this hour, we hope to be able to go from one to the other. We hope that it will nonetheless operate as an open news meeting. When people have thoughts, if they've got stories to tell, if they have observations, please do bring them in. But I suppose the reason that we've got the chance to do this is that John Preston has written this book, Fall. And it's the mystery of Robert Maxwell. The curious thing, of course, about the book, John, is that there is a mystery to Robert Maxwell. There's also so much stuff that's not mysterious. In fact, the stuff that's not mysterious is sometimes harder to believe. And if we can, I wanted to start just by asking, many people will have read A Very English Scandal, the story of Jeremy Thorpe. Some people have seen the film, The Dig, that's out at the moment. Why did you choose this? Why did you choose the story of a media baron who's been dead a good 30 years?
Well, I'd always been fascinated by Maxwell, and he was a kind of unavoidable presence in Fleet Street in the 1980s. And he was both ridiculed and feared, often it seemed by the same people. And what fascinated me was that he had led this extraordinarily vivid Technicolor life. And it's hard to think of anyone in the 20th century who'd actually traveled as far from his origins as Maxwell. I mean, he was brought up in this dirt poor small town in the west of what was then Czechoslovakia. I mean, really, had to share one pair of shoes with one of his brothers. He embarks to Belgrade and Bratislava to find his fortune. Most of his family are wiped out by the Nazis. And he becomes a very successful publisher. And then in later life, embarks on what turns out to be this catastrophic quest to become the world's largest media baron. So it seemed to me it was a bit like Citizen Kane and The Great Gatsby rolled into one.
Mm-hmm. And did you? The curious thing is, I'll confess that when I got the book, I was incredibly excited. A sort of probably a misplaced glee at the story that was about to unfold. And then the more you read it, or at least the more I read it, the sadder I became. It seems so, there's so much pain and so many lies and so many broken, discarded people and people badly treated. Did your experience of writing it, particularly given your understanding of the Maxwell family, did it change from an understanding of power to an understanding of a personality, and particularly Maxwell's personality?
Yes, I mean, I hadn't realized before what a tragic story it was in some respects. And there's a kind of terrible morality tale going on there, in a sense. Maxwell was a classic example of someone for whom nothing was ever enough. And you have this sense as he becomes older and more enormous and more desperate of him kind of clutching for this elusive thing that's going to bring him a measure of contentment and fulfillment. And, he never plainly gets it. I mean, but on the other hand, he was a dreadful ogre in lots and lots of respects. It just seemed to me that he was an ogre. It was a very nuanced ogre, if you like, with some engaging vulnerabilities. And I just wanted to try to turn him into less of a pantomime villain and to see him in slightly more flesh and blood terms.
So shall we do a bit of that? Because I want to talk about what Maxwell meant, what we learned in terms of business, politics, the city, etc. But why don't we start by understanding him and his family? he was clearly traumatized by the loss of so many of his closest relatives at Auschwitz. It seems as though that was a defining experience for him. How do you think that expressed itself over the course of his life?
Well, he did lose three of his siblings, both his parents and his grandfather, in Auschwitz. And of course, that is, in a way, the prism that you have to view Maxwell through. It doesn't necessarily excuse what he was or what he became. I mean, but nonetheless, this kind of, he tried to negate his Judaism for years and years and years. And, he changed his name 4 times by the time he was 23. He became Robert Maxwell. When he became an MP, the Jewish Chronicle phoned him up and said, "Oh, wonderful to have another Jewish MP." And Maxwell said, "I'm not Jewish," and put the phone down. So you get this sense of this flight from his origins. And yet, in roughly the same time he takes over the Mirror in the mid-80s, he does rediscover his Judaism, and you feel somewhere that Maxwell, who was a supremely unintrospective man, was nonetheless seeking to make some measure of sense of his life.
And you pick up on this point at the beginning of the book and at the end, the extent to which Maxwell changed his identity 4 times, was so often reinventing it for the moment. At the very beginning of the book, there's a moment where he's coming in and buying the New York Daily News and describing himself as a New Yorker. There's an extraordinary moment towards the end of the book where I think he's in Edinburgh looking up at the Mound and talking, to Scotsmen like us. Do you think that there was something at root that he just genuinely believed that he was that person, that there was something in him that he thought he had that everyman?
I think it's more that he didn't entirely know who on earth he was and was seeking some sort of external validation, as it were, which to some extent would explain his mania for slapping photographs of himself all over the Daily Mirror, and indeed most of his other publications. Of course, that was a symptom of his narcissism and his egomania. But on the other hand, there is this sense that he never really knew who he was or quite believed in who he was.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So can I ask you about the relationship with Betty, his wife? How do you understand that marriage?
Well, it was an absolute love match to begin with. And you read their love letters to one another, and they're very, very tender and passionate. And they have 9 children, and 2 of them die. There's a daughter who dies of meningitis when she's very, very small. And then Michael, the heir apparent, the oldest son, is very badly injured in a car crash, spends the next 7 years in a coma. And it's from that moment on that the family really starts to fracture. And Betty tries her hardest, very valiantly, to keep the family together, or to keep some semblance of family life together, when Maxwell is becoming steadily more and more isolated, turning his back on his family. And he treated Betty appallingly, and she couldn't understand why he turned on her with such virulence, and tried to explain it to herself by saying that, oh, well, when he rediscovered his Judaism, he blamed her for not being Jewish. I personally, doesn't really wash with me. But
do you think, because will you just explain the relationship with Andrea Martin and how that was will you explain it, but will you explain it in the context of this?
Well, Maxwell, when he took over the Mirror, the marriage to Betty was pretty much over by then, and he was spending more and more time in London, holed up in his apartment in Maxwell House. And he fell in love in a kind of sort of doomed romantic way with his PA, Andrea Martin, who was approximately 40 years younger than him. And they did have an affair, but then she went off with the Mirror's foreign editor, a man called Nick Sneaky Davis, as he was known, with, I think, ample reason. And Maxwell was heartbroken. It was one of the things that tipped him to the brink. You know, when everything starts to unravel in the last 2 or 3 years of Maxwell's life, that is one of the major contributory factors.
So this fractured family, this man with quite a fragmented sense of himself. One of the themes of the book that, as you can imagine, fascinated me was his sense of rivalry with Rupert Murdoch. And it's fascinating to me, even, John, that I should say to anyone, you know that people in the media are always blamed for reading the last page of the book first to see the acknowledgements. The thing you have to read when you read John's book is you have to read the people who he interviewed. It's absolutely fascinating list of people who were willing and able to talk about Robert Maxwell. And one of them was Rupert Murdoch. And I'm interested to know what you make of that relationship and what it makes you think, not just about Robert Maxwell, but about Rupert Murdoch too.
Well, I think that, you know, for 30 years, almost 30 years, Maxwell and Murdoch were locked in this kind of titanic struggle for domination, really. And yet, you know, Maxwell became obsessed by Murdoch. And every time Maxwell tried to buy a newspaper, Murdoch would snatch it from under his nose. And, you know, he becomes Maxwell's nemesis. I think that as far as Murdoch was concerned, Maxwell was this kind of irritant, and it used to infuriate him that their names were constantly mentioned in the same breath. And the fact that they shared the same initials as well was even more infuriating. And so Murdoch saw Maxwell as a buffoon, and Maxwell saw Murdoch. He was terribly envious of Murdoch, and in a way kind of sought Murdoch's approval, which of course he was never going to get. And he wanted to be in the same arena as Murdoch. And indeed, I remember one of the first conversations I had with Ian Maxwell, one of Maxwell's sons. He said, you know, what you have to remember is that there was a time when the only two people on earth breathing the same air were my father and Rupert Murdoch. And that is, you know, actually to some extent true. And I think that Maxwell's obsession with Murdoch did precipitate his downfall and his disintegration, and to some extent, ultimately his death.
I mean, it is completely fascinating reading it as a journalist, your book, because I mean, it does blow apart the idea that there's some separation between the proprietor and the editor. The way in which, certainly in Maxwell's papers, he just, you know, blundered his way into the pages of the papers is amazing. There's a moment at the very, very start of the book, John, where he buys the New York Daily News. And he asks, I think it's Jim Hogue, who's the editor, to call, I may have got that wrong, but I think it's Hogue.
Yeah.
That he won't call Murdoch himself,
no.
But he wants Hogue to call Murdoch and tell him that he's just bought the New York Daily News. And then the thing that I'm intrigued to know is that when he calls him, as you reported, Murdoch laughs for a long time, and then says rather courteously, will you tell Mr. or say to Mr. Maxwell, thank you for letting me know. What did you think the laugh meant?
I think I felt that it was very ironic laughter on Murdoch's behalf, but there was a kind of forerunner to this story, which is that years earlier, there'd been, as you remember, there was Today, which was a kind of short-lived, the first colour tabloid set up by Eddie Shah. And Maxwell wanted to buy it, and he thought he had bought it, and very unwisely phoned up Murdoch, who was in LA at the time, to boast, I've just bought Today. But during the conversation, he let slip that actually the contract hasn't been signed. So Murdoch gets on a plane, comes over to London, and essentially nicks Today from under Maxwell's nose. And it was clearly, I mean, Murdoch always said, oh, you know, it was always personal with Maxwell and it was never personal with me. And actually, plainly, it was personal because, you know, and Murdoch got a great he obviously relished the fact that that Maxwell was just like a kind of bear that he could stab and infuriate.
Well, can I say one of the things that I've loved about the publication of this book has been also the way it's wound people up. I read Max Hastings' column about it the other day, and Max is sort of wound up all over again. I must say, in a way that I find incredibly sympathetic, which is he's not wound up by the terrible behavior of Robert Maxwell, which he thinks is terrible. He's wound up by the extent to which the city institutions, the establishment, aid and abet him. And when you get towards the end of your book, there's this sort of bizarre chapter where all the world's great and good write letters of condolence to Betty Maxwell. And you think to yourself, my goodness, did none of them see it? Or is there just a sense that we don't comment on these things? And I wanted to bring in Bronwyn Maddox if I could, because when I started, I said from my time beginning as a journalist, when I started as a reporter at the FT in 1994, we lived in the shadow of a piece of reporting that Bronwyn had done. Bronwyn, by the way, runs the Institute for Government, has an actual day job. But I'm bringing you in, Bronwyn, because when I started at the FT, you'd done this amazing piece of reporting, and there hadn't really been financial journalism like it, which was, I think you'd been through sort of the company reports of every single one of Robert Maxwell's companies and tried to piece together the extent of his financial chicanery. And I wondered whether I could take you back there just to the process of reporting it at the time, what you thought you were looking for and what you found.
I knew what I was looking for. I'd been a city analyst following Robert Maxwell's company, among other things. And that meant quite a lot of encounters with Robert Maxwell and his son Kevin in particular, and always high in colour, and very much fitting the story that John has been telling. So it had become, I joined the FT in the late summer of that year that he died, 1991. I joined in about August. And it had begun pitching up in Companies House that Maxwell was mortgaging a lot of his assets in his companies. The public companies were the most obvious, the ones floated on the stock market, and that included Maxwell Communications and Mirror Group newspapers. But we knew that there were an awful lot of private companies behind that. And when I got to the Financial Times, I talked to the editor, Richard Lambert, then, who said, but one of the nicest things anyone's ever said to me in professional life, which is go get all the company reports that exist. And everyone that came, it would reveal that it had more subsidiaries or more ultimate owners. And so we'd get the company reports on those. There turned out to be 800. And I started laying them out on the floor of the Financial Times newsroom. With the help of actually a Czech researcher who was very interested, Robert Maxwell himself being Czech. And we laid out these 800, and then I began drawing heavily into my skills as an analyst, and rather worried about those, trying to add up all the debt of this incredibly intricate map of companies and holding companies, and many of the routes led back to Liechtenstein. It was a structure designed to frustrate scrutiny, but the one thing you could get hold of was the debt, and check that against the interest payments that these companies were making. And it became clear that a lot had been mortgaged, particularly in the final year of his life. So the two big American acquisitions that he'd made in pursuit of being bigger and bigger. I remember one of the last times I saw him, he said, we're going to have turnover of 5 billion and profits to match. And he said, what does that mean in terms of profits? Nothing, or very little, it turned out to be. But he made these two very big American acquisitions 3 years before he died, called Macmillan. It's a US publisher with the same name as a UK publisher, and an airline guide. And those were the ones that took him to a level of debt that he couldn't sustain. And what became clear was he was scrambling for cash, particularly in the final year of his life, and mortgaging everything. So actually, as it happened, I'd added all this up, and it came to a rather large number, the debt. And I rang up Kevin Maxwell, who I knew from being an analyst, and went to see him on what turned out to be the morning that Maxwell disappeared, and put this chart in front of him and said, look, these appear to be your companies, and this appears to be the amount of debt it's trying to sustain, which looks unsustainable. And he said, and rather insouciant, quite relaxed. He said, we don't lay it out quite like that, but that is about right. But in my view, it is sustainable. And then I got back to the office and it flashed up, Maxwell missing at sea. And so we printed this map that night, and went on from there. But what it revealed,
you printed it the night. So he we'll come to the nature of his death in a moment, but he disappeared into the sea overnight, and you saw Kevin Maxwell that morning.
Yeah.
Was Kevin Maxwell aware that he had gone missing?
No. Neither of us was aware in that conversation, and only when I got back to the office did the news break. Which, I mean, I guess you can't pray for luck like that, but it had come out of weeks of work and obviously knowing Kevin Maxwell for some time as an analyst. Sorry, go on.
And just I wanted to come back to you and John, because there's the point that Max Hastings was making, and I was supposedly just sort of nodding at in the chapter of John's book that deals with all the sort of, words of praise for the life he lived, was that overwhelmingly the city and the establishment, saw the man that he was, but supported him financially when he was on a roll. And I see one of the points in the chat was how does the world sort of allow such terrible behavior to continue? And I wondered whether you've got sympathy for that Max Hastings point that, the different institutions, actually enabled the behavior and enabled the collapse of his business empire in the end. It didn't just fall to him.
I have no sympathy for those people. They took a lot of money from him. They made it possible in terms of continuing to represent his shares, not asking the questions about the debt. But I would say, a few things. The fraud did happen fairly quickly. The last year and a half, I would say, prompted by these acquisitions only 3 years before he died. And one of the very striking things is just how quickly money was taken by Robert Maxwell, as John tells in his book, from companies' bank accounts with the promise that it would come back. Shares were borrowed from the pension funds. At that point, that was legal if the people making that borrowing thought that the money could be repaid. Pension regulation was enormously tightened as a result. And what was very interesting about the fraud was that many steps of it would be legal if you were a person just helping with that transaction and you thought or hoped in some kind of wishful thinking that the money was going to come back, that Robert Maxwell would be true to his word, that the money was just being borrowed and not, as it turned out, going into a black hole to prop up the whole shebang. And so, it's not just the court cases turned on knowledge and did people really know the whole picture, but it tells you something about fraud, I think, of why people get sucked into it. And which John tells as well, of these people who Robert Maxwell got to work with him, really quite sad figures, some of them living alone in the Barbican, working night and day for Robert Maxwell, dragged into this. And then it becomes very, very hard for them to get themselves out of this. They're just always waiting for the next step, hoping the money will come back, but it never does.
Bronwyn, thank you. I wanted, John, before I just go back to you on this, I want to see if I could bring in Catherine Bordino. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, Catherine. Because you were saying that the banks were queuing up to lend more to Robert Maxwell, but if I read right in the chat and from the blogs you posted, that you had experience of working with him.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like?
Well, it was actually quite funny because I was CEO of 2 companies of his, and I was also part of the inner sanctum to launch the European. So I had quite a lot of contact with him at a senior level. In fact, it was only Eve Pollard and I who were the 2 senior women in the empire. I do not call it an organization. He was a bully. He was an absolute bully. But I had a relationship with him, so to speak, where I think my sense of humor and the fact I was a woman I was never exposed to that. I saw him, I heard him beating up Peter J like a punch ball, which was actually what he was. But with me, never so, never so.
And I'm intrigued by that. For people who don't know, one of the extraordinary things is the idea of Peter J, former British ambassador to US, taking his job.
I know.
What do you think was the psychology of Peter J, who had this sort of grand standing? I think he'd been the economics editor of the BBC. He had a sort of standing of his own, and then became, well, you described it as a punch bag. I thought
Totally.
it was a bag man for Robert Maxwell. I mean, not just money.
Principally money. Principally money. I mean, don't forget the time he had made his mistress pregnant, and he was a keen sailor and had to maintain his sailing habits. I can see I'm making our author laugh. Sorry, John. I presume my statements are echoing your research.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, Maxwell had this kind of extraordinary talent for taking people who were rather kind of posh or had been rather distinguished and then were kind of down on their luck. And he would give them these absurdly inflated titles. Peter J became his chief of staff.
Yeah.
And yes, he would treat them appallingly. But I completely agree that he was, amongst his many sins, I don't think he wasn't actually particularly sexist. I mean, he was a sort of equal opportunities offender in that respect.
Not at all sexist.
And Catherine, what do you make of the point that I don't know whether you saw my colleague Kerry made in the chat, picked up on a sort of a moment in John's book where he's brutally and kind of sacked someone and then brings him breakfast in bed as a sort of, could he blow very hot and cold, Robert Maxwell?
Yes, he could. And there was a side of him which was actually quite gentle. I mean, he was a very polite man. He was very charming. And by the way, I was in his office a few times when he called the other RM, Murdoch, and he was more than civil with Murdoch. And there didn't seem to be, because I couldn't hear what Murdoch was saying, there didn't seem to be any friction there. But if I may, can I give you a story quickly? A Murdoch
we're in the
story.
market for stories.
Yes. When I was chief executive of Maxwell Satellite, the DTI, as it was releasing 6 satellite communication licenses to successful applicants. And little satellite, Maxwell Satellite, which I headed up, was one of the applicants, as was BSB.
Yes.
Before B Sky B, right? We're in the 80s here. And there was, I mean, the Reuters, Thorny EMI, really a lot of applicants, 23 applicants for 6 licenses. Anyhow, I ended up, Maxwell Satellite ended up getting one of the licenses. And notwithstanding, we were called Maxwell Satellite. So we were applying for the same institution that had made him unfit to run public company. And in spite of all that, managed to get the license. As it is, that night, Maxwell called me at home, and which he rarely did. And he said to me, "I've just heard from David." David is Lord Young to you and me. "I just heard from David that you got one of the licenses." I told him I wasn't surprised at all. You're prettier and tougher than them. And of course, you know, he got this over Rupert Murdoch. Yes. So my glory, I think, was not the fact that I got it from the DTI, but from the fact that Murdoch didn't get one.
But Catherine, it tells you so many different things. A, that passed for a compliment.
Yes.
B, that he was delighted to get one over on Rupert Murdoch. Yep. And C, most interestingly, or you know, that the DTI could in one part of the shop say that he wasn't fit for office, and on the other hand, hand him, not just a license, but a license to a, strategic new industry. I'm going to, Catherine, I'd love to hear
I've
more.
taken up enough time, sorry.
No, it's a complete pleasure. I'm going to come back to John in a moment, but I want to just pick up on two things. Jason Nisses just made a point about the coverage of Maxwell while he was alive and while he was at the Independent. And I want to just see, Fiammetta Rocco just talked about the list of people who were, sort of in the court, in the empire. And then I'm aware of time, I want to spend the second half hour beginning to look at Ghislaine Maxwell and the relationship between, Robert Maxwell's life and her situation now. Jason, you there?
Yes. So, I mean, when Maxwell was alive, most of Fleet Street didn't attack him. They stood off him. But when we started picking up stuff, which was about a year, at the team of the Independent, we picked up stuff about a year, 18 months before he died, that things weren't going very well. And Andreas Whitten-Smith said, we're not holding off. This man's a monster. We've got to go for him. And then we started picking up stuff about him and his financial shenanigans. And I'll call them out. Goldman Sachs was basically hiding the debts for people. And we discovered what was going on. And then Maxwell went for us big time. We were sued. I think there were 8 outstanding writs when he died. He injuncted us for a while, but we managed to get the injunction lifted. He famously told me to F off at, I think it was the Maxwell Communications AGM. I can't remember whether it was that or the Mirror Group, which had, if anybody remembers working with Ray Snoddy got more incensed about it than I did. But what was amazing, and a similar thing happened with Conrad Black at the Telegraph, was that Fleet Street didn't want to attack one of their own until somebody else called them out. And I think that, it's very brave, the FT, it was very brave, Private Eye did a lot of good work, and the team, the Independent, did a great deal of work. Most other people just left off him.
It's a really, I mean, this is a recurrent theme, isn't it, in Britain's coverage of its own media, Jason, the extent to which it does or doesn't choose to delve there. I just want to thank you for that. I just wanted to also just pick up on the point that Fiammetta made. Fiammetta, I don't know whether Fiammetta Rocco's there. You were just talking about the sort of long list of courtiers.
Oh, I mean, it was quite extraordinary. Just to quick point back to Jason, of course, Andreas Smith was very, very against him, but Maxwell was one of the, not first group of investors, but second group of investors in the Independent. And that relationship finished very badly. But just getting to the city people. So Michael Richardson, a banker, N.M. Rothschild, and he was there for Maxwell, not just to the end, but beyond the end. He accompanied his body to Jerusalem when he was buried. He never gave up on him. I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary that even beyond death, there were people in the city
who would
hang in there.
There were also, to be fair, people in the city who were just absolutely opposed to him from the start. I mean, I noticed in John's book the accounts that he and Jacob Rothschild had a falling out, and they never patched up. John, I want to, though, as I said, and Fiammetta, thank you. I want to, if I might, try and see what links, and maybe there are none, so I don't want to presume, links to the story that's unfolding that's the front of a lot of people's minds around Ghislaine Maxwell. And I want to come to you, and then I'm going to ask Conchita Sarnoff to come in. Conchita, partly because she knows Ghislaine, but mostly because she's written a book about trafficking, and I'm interested to hear your perspective. But I'm going to start, if I might, just by reading one thing in the book that really sort of kind of punched me in the chest, which is there's this quote from Ghislaine after Maxwell has died, right? After he has either fallen from the Lady Ghislaine, the boat, or he's committed suicide, thrown himself off the boat. And she says, he wasn't a crook. A thief to me is somebody who steals money. Do I think my father did that? No. I don't know what he did. Obviously, something happened. Did he put it in his own pocket? Did he run off with the money? No. And that's my definition of a crook. And then she just has this line about the fact that she and there's the Maxwells will be back. And I just wondered, you've been writing this book while this story about Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell has just dominated our news, or been a big story in the news. What is the link that you make between the two? Oh, sorry, you've muted yourself. Oh, there you are, you're back.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm dubious of drawing too close a parallel between Maxwell and Epstein. I mean, I think that Ghislaine, all the children had pretty miserable childhoods in a lot of respect. I mean, growing up in Headington Hill Hall was really not a whole heap of fun. Ghislaine was the youngest. She was completely overshadowed by the fact that at almost exactly the same time she was born, Michael, the eldest son, was very badly injured in a car crash and was in a coma. And so she goes from being on the outside of the family circle to becoming her father's favorite. And she's very adept at diffusing his rages and these kind of terrible Sunday lunches where they all have to give off. Each child has to kind of say their piece about what they hope to accomplish in the week ahead and, you know, current affairs, issues of the day and so on. She wasn't as frightened of her father as the others were. And, you know, I suppose to stretch a point, you know, if she became very adept at pleasing her father, you could argue that she was also adept at pleasing Epstein. But I think that, you know, they're very, very different people. You know, Maxwell was a colossal blowhard who had to dominate any room that he was in. Epstein seems to me to be a figure who, you know, belongs behind the arras, as it were. You know, he's really not trying to draw attention to himself for pretty obvious reasons. You know, there's been a lot of stuff about how Epstein supposedly laundered money for Maxwell. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest they ever met. You know, plainly Epstein had money, and, you know, Ghislaine, if you're constantly being described as a socialite in a newspaper, what do? You know, you attend a lot of parties, and she was, you know, whatever people said, the money wasn't there when Maxwell died. So Epstein did presumably give her a kind of passport to carry that sort of thing on. You know, I didn't talk to her for the book. At one point, I thought she was going to talk, and then we were rather overtaken by events. You know, I'm as kind of stunned as anybody by how she ended up in this position, if that's really what she did.
Let me ask Conchita, because I think Conchita, I'm really interested to hear what you think on both fronts. I think you knew her, as I understand it, and obviously you've written on the issue. So tell us what you think. Firstly, I mean, give us your view.
Yes, James. Well, I agree with John. I agree with what John just said, that there isn't really a parallel between Robert Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. And secondly, that, you know, there really wasn't a there. I mean, in terms of Ghislaine, I met Ghislaine in the early 90s, shortly after I met Epstein. And Ghislaine was just that. She wanted to be, in my opinion, wanted to be liked, cracking jokes all the time. I met her with one of her closest friends who had gone with her to Oxford, who regretfully I can't say his name because he does not wish to be identified. But so she was very comfortable the day that I met her. We met at a dinner, and she seemed rather superficial, which in fact she was in a way, and in another way, you know, she was someone who was well educated, and she had this ambition, which seemed to me at the time was just
you know, it wasn't quite clear whether she just wanted to imitate her mother, even though she had a very strenuous relationship with her mother. But she seemed to just want to fly around and, you know, and have fun. And I mean, it was just, she didn't seem to be a woman of substance in any way.
Conchita,
Yes.
firstly, before we get into just sort of doing a little bit more of the relationship between her family and her life,
Yes.
just tell us a little bit about your reporting on this, because the reporting you've done is actually looking at the whole issue of child sex trafficking in the Epstein case and her
Yes.
role in it. And there's quite a lot of confusion about what the case is now against Ghislaine Maxwell, the
Yes.
bail that has been, she's not been able to be granted bail. What's your read on
I'm sorry, James. I'm having
what that came from. So sorry, could you? I just wanted you to give us your read on what the nature of the case is against Ghislaine Maxwell, why they've refused bail for her, and what your reporting tells us should understand her role in the Epstein, you know, in Epstein's crimes.
Absolutely. So the only reason that Ghislaine and Jeffrey Epstein even came back into my radar screen was because as I'm investigating human trafficking, particularly child sex trafficking cases in the United States, I came across this one particular case, which led me to the Epstein case. And when I realized that Epstein was trafficking children out of across the United States, I immediately ran to the police station at Palm Beach. And I purchased the police reports at the time. This is in 2009. And lo and behold, Ghislaine's name was in almost every single police report. And I was shocked. I mean, I was shocked. I remember I had my BlackBerry with me and I had walked out of the Palm Beach police station on South County line. And there was a little park across the street. And I sat down, and as I'm reading through these pages, information that you couldn't even believe, if you couldn't believe it was just so heinous that, and I saw her name in almost every page. I called her immediately and I said, Ghislaine, it's Conchita. I hadn't spoken to her in a number of years. I think it was the last time I saw her, I think was before that time, was 2005 at Epstein's house in Palm Beach. And we had spent the New Year's together at a friend's house. And then Ghislaine and Jeffrey had invited me and our host to breakfast on January 1st at Epstein's home. And we declined. And so I went to lunch with them a week later at his home with Ghislaine, and I brought a friend of mine. And anyway, so I said to Ghislaine, I am very concerned. I'm calling you because I had already done a lot of advocacy work, 3 years worth of advocacy work. And so I said, you know, I'm doing this and I'm looking at your name in every other page. And she literally just laughed and shrugged it off as if either I was lying or she was shocked, but it was ridiculous. And she said just that. Oh, that's ridiculous. And I said, I don't know if this is ridiculous or not, but I hope you have a very good lawyer, because of course I had no idea then.
And now when you, in the time that you, I'm very aware that in having this conversation, Conchita, and in fact the whole fascination with Ghislaine Maxwell happens almost despite or even regardless of the experiences of the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse. I'm interested to know, when you speak to those people, you know, women who, you know, were young and abused by Jeffrey Epstein, whether they even want to get to understand the story of Ghislaine Maxwell, or themselves are infuriated by the fascination with her.
Yes, I heard, excuse me, only half. The sound is terrible, but
How do you get what the survivors of Epstein's abuse are feeling about the whole nature of this trial?
at the time, I interviewed many of the victims back in 2009 and continuously, but at the time, they were feeling obviously and justifiably so angry. They were very angry at what the Department of Justice had agreed to do. That is, sign a non-prosecution agreement. They were angry at the state attorney's office, and they were also petrified, because what I kept on hearing time after time was that Ghislaine and Jeffrey together were very powerful, were very rich, and were very scary. And that word, was consistently used by the victims. They're very scary because they did, after the investigation began, I know that I think Epstein more so than Maxwell, than Ghislaine, he had his people follow these victims and threaten the victims and threaten the families in order not to come forward.
Right.
So they were quite scared. They were actually more scared. That's why Virginia Roberts Giuffre stayed in Australia. And it wasn't until she sold her story to the Daily Mail, to Sharon Churcher, that, everything came out. It was after the Daily Beast report, after I broke the story in that 6-part series, that Virginia finally came out, because purposely, because I am an advocate and I work with victims, I never identify the names of any victim. I don't want to re-traumatize a victim, and it is unethical and unprofessional to do so. And so I had named the victims as they were identified in the complaints, Jane Doe 1, Jane Doe 102, which happened to be Virginia Giuffre, et cetera. And so it really wasn't until Sharon Churcher published her story concerning Prince Andrew and Ghislaine and Virginia Giuffre that everything really started to change. Because my series was muzzled, as you know.
And Conchita, what's your read on what will happen now in terms of her trial?
Well, as you might know, yesterday, or forgive me, Monday in the hearing, she was once again denied her request, which was to hide one of the depositions, basically to keep one of the depositions sealed. And Judge Preska decided that whatever was in that deposition, in those lines, were going to be released to the public. I believe that Ghislaine and Ghislaine's attorneys are, they're fighting a lost cause. Either Ghislaine talks and points fingers at those she needs to point fingers at, or she's going to see herself 35 years in jail.
Okay, that's John. I'm going to come to you. I'm just aware of the time left, because I want to try and sort of round out what we understand of what happened with the Maxwell family, and fear not, everyone, I am going to come to Nicola Glucksmann to ask about the story of the party at Headington Hill Hall. But John, just picking up on that, on what happens and the outcome that Conchita was describing in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, can you tell us just where did the Maxwell family end up?
Well, I think that all of them have suffered pretty badly in a sense that, they were, the Maxwell family name was a kind of pretty big stigma, and the obvious people who suffered were Kevin and Ian. And I think it's true to say that both of them have found it difficult to to get businesses off the ground and so on and so forth. I mean, there was this widespread perception that there was vast amounts of money salted away in Liechtenstein, and there really doesn't seem to be at all. I mean, it's conceivable some money might have been settled on Ghislaine. She seems to have ended up with rather more money than anybody else. I think it's plainly been life has been difficult for them, because Maxwell, he's still seen 30 years on as the kind of embodiment of corporate villainy.
And how much do you take? And this is psycho inference, so it's probably a bad idea, John. But the extent to which, the daughter, the youngest daughter in a family that itself is, struck in its own ways by grief. The father is has got these, by any measure, issues of narcissism and abuse of power, a broken family. And then I noticed Catherine saying, denied any chance to live her own life professionally, and having grown up in these Headington Hill Hall parties, that she's sort of sent into this world. There's no way to, excuse or even explain child sex trafficking, but why she found herself in this sort of social whirlygig.
Well, I don't think
that you draw.
Well, I don't think she wasn't denied an opportunity to earn a living. I mean, no one forced her to become a socialite. That was the life that she chose for herself. And then she got involved in this sort of cockamamie idea to classify the world's oceans as a nation at the UN, which seemed to me kind of batty. So, I mean, nobody, as I say, no one forced her to become a socialite. No one forced her to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein. Those are things that she plainly undertook of her own volition.
Fair point. Bronwyn, can I ask you for one final thought, which is, did the world learn any lessons? Did media, did politics, did business get any better for what it learned from Robert Maxwell?
I think it did. I think pension protection got tightened up enormously. Banks and stockbrokers became much more careful about representing people like him. And I think an appreciation of how fraud can happen. Obviously, there have been many frauds since. There are going to be still in the future, but appreciation of how fraud can happen, I think was raised by this. I mean, we do have, I do think there are parallels in what we've just been talking about. You've got, at the end of it all, a trial where the main perpetrator of the crimes is dead. In my view, Maxwell did kill himself, but that's to be debated. And you've got this flotsam and jetsam of the people that they've implicated or brought down with them around that. And I think Maxwell did bring home just how people can get drawn into that, and perhaps made a few people a bit warier, including perhaps a few financial advisors. But certainly there was some regulation, and people did learn that there can be a lot under the surface.
Bronwyn, thank you. Nicola Glucksmann, you've raised a question. There are a fair few descriptions of Headington Hill Hall parties, the home of Robert and Betty Maxwell. By the sound of things, you went to one.
I went to a house, but it was a weekend, it was a country retreat. And I was there because Ghislaine at that time was very friendly with Lisa Belsberg, who in fact is a good friend of mine who introduced her to Epstein. And I was really interested in everything that John and Conchita said, because certainly that was a kind of studied superficiality she had about her. She was very sassy, but very savvy. And of course, already then she'd won the Oedipal battle. She had displaced her mother in her own fantasies and carried tremendous guilt about that. And you either were the kind of woman like her mother who had no value to this potent male ego, or you were sort of some kind of, I think the ancient Greek word was hetera, was an educated courtesan, and that's who Ghislaine was. And Ghislaine turned to Epstein, as Lisa and I have always understood it, for the same protection that she believed she had from her father. But of course, it was based on complete unpredictability, because her father could turn on her as quickly as he could turn on anybody else. So you were lifted up or you were crushed. But at this weekend, where there was Susanna Constantine, who of Trini and Susanna, and somebody called Steve Wyatt, who was the son of a Texan socialite, and 2 or 3 other people I can't remember, because it was, I think, about 3 months. It was very shortly before he died. And Ghislaine was, again, working, singing for her supper, which is what I think she's felt she's always had to do in any social environment. Being Ghislaine wasn't enough. She had to create the atmosphere, create the party. And we had a perfectly nice meal. And then she announced, as a sort of MC, that she was now in charge of games. And the first game was that she came out of the next room, where she had retired briefly, with blindfolds. And she blindfolded all the men at the table, who I think were 5. And then the women were to take off their tops and their bras and present their breasts to the men, who were to identify the women from the size and touch, feel of their breasts. I have to say, Lisa and I retired, which as old ladies we now rather regret, because we never found out what really happened. But it was it's always haunted me, because there was something about her understanding of sex as simply a currency that did, come back to haunt me when I watched this tragedy unfold.
Nicola, thank you. It's extraordinarily lost for words story, really. That's not the internet not working. That's just my mind trying to figure out what that means and what that tells you, and quite a good deal, no doubt. I'm aware that we had an hour for this thinking, and by the sounds of things, we could have gone on a good deal longer. A big thank you to you, John Preston, for initiating this conversation and for the book that you've written. Bronwyn, a huge thank you to taking us back into the reporting that you did, and also drawing the dots and the lines to where we are now. Conchita as well, thank you for actually helping us understand quite so clearly this story, and a big thank you, I really do appreciate, Nicola, you telling that story, Catherine coming in and telling those stories too. The idea of ThinkIn was to make sure that we could open up these kinds of conversations and hear from as many people as possible. It makes me wish that we were doing a series of these just in understanding the Maxwells, because there's so much to learn and to understand. But for this evening, thank you. Keep safe, keep yourselves in good spirits, and stay warm. Thank you very much indeed.